All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending today. My name is Luke Baumgartner. I'm a research fellow here at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. And today I'm joined by author and journalist Leah Sottile to discuss her new book, Blazing Eye Sees All. So, Leah, I will let you do the honors and introduce yourself so I don't miss anything important.
Sure. So my name's Leah Sottile. I'm a freelance journalist based in Oregon for the last, gosh, I guess it's been probably about a decade now. I've been predominantly covering political and religious extremism in the West. Um, that's taken a whole lot of forms. So I make podcasts, I've written books. Um, Particularly, I did a podcast called Bundyville that ran for 2 seasons, which was about the Bundy family of Nevada and their protests over public lands in the West and their takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in 2016 and all their ideas that they kind of drove their protests, I guess you would call. I also have done a podcast about the Oklahoma City bombing called 2 Minutes Past Nine, as well as another project called Burn Wild, which is about the Earth Liberation Front. And I have another book besides the one that just came out. It's called When the Moon Turns to Blood, and it's about the really tragic case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, who were driven by their extreme Mormon belief system to go on a murder spree across the West.
Great. Well, thank you for that thorough introduction. So we're going to hop right to it and start talking about your latest work, Blazing Eye Sees All. So broadly speaking, what is the book about and what sort of inspired you to take on this project?
Yeah, I mean, and to be frank with you, I really wanted to not write a book on extremism. That's where the project started. And what doing the work as a journalist on extremism is very tiring. It's something that kind of grates at you and you start to wonder like, why am I thinking about all these things all the time? So by about 2022, when my first book came out, When the Moon Turns to Blood, I was like, I want to write another book, but I'd like for it to be a bit of a palate cleanser on this extremism stuff. So I'd kind of been picking up a lot about the new age. I live in Portland, Oregon. There are quite a few places that you can buy new age books and crystals and, I also during COVID noticed a lot of people kind of in that space becoming influencers, whether they were health coaches or gurus or selling, yoga retreats and things like that. So I just was interested as somebody who likes to report on subcultures in that world. And so I started reporting and I, got a book contract to write about the new age. And because I feel like maybe I might be sort of a bloodhound for this stuff at this point, I realized before I knew it, I was writing another book on extremism. It was just sort of aesthetically a different flavor than maybe the Patriot movement stuff that I'd been working on so much at that point. So the book is about that. It's about new age ideas in America. It was also inspired by this group called Love Has Won that was based out of Colorado that I had done some reporting on. And what I was trying to understand was why the leader of that group had a lot of the ideas that she professed, like where did those come from? And so the book is really trying to understand how this woman in Colorado who called herself Mother God, how her beliefs connected to a long, long history in America of sort of like alternative spirituality and what we would call the New Age.
Yeah, so I think that's a good jumping off point to kind of start with. You start the book off with this sort of unexpected, short chapter about lemurs, and this fabled place called Lemuria, that to kind of set the stage for the rest of the New Age movement, as we know it today. So how does that tale of a lost continent of Lemuria fit into the broader narrative of the book, relating to the New Age movement and overall the story of Love Has Won?
So what I realized when I was writing this is that it's a weird world, right? There's a lot of ideas in this world where they are not scientific beliefs that people really believe in as like a quasi spirituality. So how do you write about those things? So I started to focus on this idea of Lemuria. Part of the reason for that was it's a really popular belief within the New Age, but also Amy Carlson, aka Mother God, who ran this group called Love Has Won, she would often tell her followers that she was a reincarnated being, that she'd lived many, many lives, including Joan of Arc and Cleopatra, but also as the Queen of Lemuria. And, I started to see a lot of people saying that about her. And I guess as a journalist, sometimes I'm like, sorry, I just need to ask the dumb question. What is Lemuria? Like, I had no idea what that was. So what I found was that there are two basic definitions here of Lemuria. There's Lemuria, the theory that was floated by a scientist, and then there's Lemuria, the spiritual belief. So in the 1800s, an ornithologist, a guy who studied birds, wrote this academic paper where he was trying to come up with a theory of why there are lemurs, those cute little animal primates that we see in like Disney movies, why they were based in India and Madagascar, but not in Africa or anywhere else. And so the theory that he floated was that there used to be a continent between India and Madagascar that must have just sunk into the ocean. And he has this line in his academic paper where he's like, I propose we call it Lemuria. Like, that's a great name for it. This is before the science of continental drift and plate tectonics or any of this has been discovered. So by the time this guy died, this science, that this theory he floated was basically like, even he was like, yeah, it wasn't a great theory. But it was exciting to people that there was this idea that there was a place that was just that had disappeared. So even before that guy died, people within the spiritualist movement kind of took the idea of like a lost place and ran with it. And they created Lemuria as a place that was once spiritually realized, that it was a utopia of sorts, and that some kind of human error basically destroyed it and it sunk into the ocean. So that's where the idea kind of bifurcated into away from a scientific theory that was no good into something that was spiritual. And that's what the long life that Lemuria has had in the New Age is just this place that anybody could say, oh, the people who live there were the most enlightened. Oh, the people who live there, they actually had a third eye, which is the thing you hear talked about in like yoga. They had one on their foreheads or on the back of their heads or whatever. So it just became this sort of place to do your kind of new age fan fiction, I guess. Like it could
Hmm.
be anything you wanted it to be. So that idea I think could have died in the 1850s with spiritualists, and it definitely could have died when plate tectonics science and all that became accepted science. But instead, it just has been passed from generation to generation within the New Age and has become this thing that people lean on for some kind of cred. You can even go to crystal shops now and buy what are called Lemurian seed crystals and things like that. So it's just this sort of it's much like Atlantis. I think
Hmm.
Atlantis is a sort of comparison a lot more people might be familiar with, where it's like this idea that there was a place that's just gone now, and what's the reason? What are the secrets? And what are the human errors that caused it to disappear?
Yeah, it kind of gets at that intersection of, what we broadly call conspirituality, where we combine, conspiratorial beliefs and the New Age spiritualism. And it also kind of touches on this pseudo-archaeological field that's sort of, become a lot more mainstream
Yes.
in the last, couple decades with, influencers and popular journalists writing about it all the time without naming names. Um, that get their own Netflix series that go for multiple seasons. If you know, you know.
No, not naming any names here.
No. Yeah. But aside from that, in between the chapters that you're telling the broader story of Amy Carlson, aka Mother God, and the development of Love Has Won, you mentioned several, sort of quote unquote influencers before her in the New
Mhm.
Age, sort of spiritual realm that kind of help the reader to understand how these beliefs transformed throughout American history. There's quite a few that you mentioned, but there's a couple that I think are important. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but um, there's Helena Blavatsky, which is probably, the one of the most popular ones. So who was Helena and how did she influence, a lot of this sort of belief system going forward?
It delights me that you called her an influencer because I think that's actually a really like appropriate term. So Helena Blavatsky was a woman who came here from it wasn't Ukraine then, but it was now Ukraine. She was one of the first Ukrainian immigrants to live in the United States, and she came in the 1850s because she was somebody who you would call like a seeker. She was very, very excited about a wave of spiritualism that was really kind of taking flight in America at the time. And by spiritualism, I mean this idea that when someone dies, they're not gone completely. You can still communicate with them. And so at the time in America, you were seeing a big rise of psychics and mediums and people who could say, I can get you in touch with your, recently passed child or husband or things like that. So Blavatsky came to America to kind of check it out, and she really set up shop for herself as somebody who had this extraordinary ability to communicate with what she called masters. And
Hmm.
this is an important point that I think, you see carried through the book that I wrote. Was she claimed that she could communicate with these masters who were by her definition, these old wise men that lived far away in the Himalayas, and she could communicate with them psychically, or she could precipitate letters from them. So she would say to somebody, ask the masters a question about so whatever, and then, oh, look, a letter just appeared that details the answer to your specific question. So in the media at the time, people just went after her. She was like a grifter, she was a fake or whatever. But regardless, she held court with really prominent people in New York City at the time, and she founded something called the Theosophical Society. Eventually, she and her I guess spiritual partner in the Theosophical Society would move to India, and they would establish a big following there for it. And when she died, she was really kind of cast by obituary writers as like this great charlatan. But the thing that I think is really interesting is that she was really motivated by emerging science to come up with alternative spiritual theories. She was a part of a big movement of people who were like, all these scientists like Darwin are ruining spirituality. Like they're ruining religion for us. Don't listen to them. They're wrong. And so in her writings, specifically about Lemuria, she would say, don't listen to Darwin's theory of human evolution. Read my theory, how there were several root races that that allow like a spiritual kind of revolution or evolution. And one of those was that the Lemurians were the most spiritually enlightened. It was a moment in human history that kind of explained human spirituality. So she was widely influential. She wrote a lot of very dense, bonkers books, but regardless, she found a lot of followers. And after she died, there was kind of, you can track like the ways her ideas then led to new generations of spiritualists and kind of these new age personalities, eventually leading to Mother God in Colorado.
Yeah. So did Blavatsky, you briefly touched on this in the book, but do you think Blavatsky is somewhat over credited or over attributed to like influencing Nazi race science or Nazi race ideas?
I think it's a great, great question. When I started writing this book, like I was saying to you, I didn't want to write a book on extremism. I had come across a really interesting pair of biographies of Blavatsky, and I thought, this woman is fascinating. Like she was doing things, carving out a place in spirituality for herself and kind of this occultism world that was really radical at the time. So I found myself really excited about her. It was only when I dug deeper and I saw what her writing was about that I started to be like, okay, hang on. This lady was racist. And like, you can't you can't view her theories as like, well, everybody at the time was racist. I think this is a big thing a lot of people will say about Blavatsky. No, 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 don't worry about that. But to me, I'm like, there is a hierarchy of racial supremacy that anchors a lot of her books. And
Hmm.
the bottom line is that yeah, she really authored a lot of these ideas about, the Aryan race was one of the most spiritually realized. It was one of the most prime races. That's racist no matter what time in history we are. And Nazis are very excited about those ideas. So I don't think that she was the sole author of them because while Blavatsky was, a bit of a spiritual charlatan, she was also somebody who plagiarized a lot of ideas too. So, but I do think that she, like most influencers today, they may not have been her ideas uniquely, but she gave them a lot of air and got people really excited about them, got prominent people excited about them. So, so yeah, I mean, her racial history is very interesting. She would go to India and she would talk about colonization as a bad thing and she would fight for Indian liberation. She was very close to Gandhi. So like there are a lot of there are a lot of things about her that were in conflict with her ideas. But this is the thing, like you author ideas and then Nazis get excited about them, you're kind of at fault for that, I think.
Yeah, it's similar to the way that the Nazis kind of appropriated a lot of Nietzschean ideas as well. So
Yeah,
that it's kind of the similarity that I draw between them.
sure.
And then I think another one that I would want to hit on is Guy and Edna Ballard
Mhm.
and their supposed relationship to Saint Germain and the I am activity.
Mhm.
So briefly, let's discuss that and then move on to how that sort of influenced Amy Carlson and the broader Love is One movement.
Sure. So, by the 1930s, there was a pair called Guy and Edna Ballard, a married couple from Illinois, and they, after Blavatsky's death, I think the ideas that she had about Lemuria and about a lot of different things, including her hierarchy of racial supremacy, those were picked up by specifically by a guy named William Dudley Pelley. We know him. People probably watching this webinar would know that he is the person who founded the Silver Shirts, one of America's first anti-government militia groups. He at one point started a spiritual system called Soulcraft and started holding meetings and authoring books and things like that. Guy and Edna Ballard attended Pelley's meetings and basically were like, this guy's kind of an anti-Semite. That's not for us. And took the rest of his ideas. Like I say, the New Age is like a lineage of theft. They took his ideas and they started their own spiritual system called the I Am activity. And the kind of grounding principle of that is that one day Guy Ballard was hiking up the side of Mount Shasta in Northern California, a big beautiful volcano, and he encountered a person that he called Saint Germain. And we won't get into the kind of the long history in occultism around Saint Germain, but he had this very spiritual experience with Saint Germain and he came down off the mountain and he told his wife, I met Saint Germain. He selected us to be basically his proxies on earth to kind of spread his messages of love and light. So they started this group called the I Am Activity where they were kind of at the center of it and they would talk about this idea of the, violet flame that could like heal everything. It was very, very like love and light kind of stuff. Um, that group really caught on in a way that I don't think Blavatsky or Apelli before them did. They moved their group to California. They started filling the Shrine Auditorium with like tens of thousands of people who would attend their workshops. I Am activity chapters popped up all around the country and really made Mount Shasta this like big important place within the New Age. So that's I could go into a lot more about I Am, but I think one thing that's really interesting about them is they rejected Pelley's anti-Semitism, but as a part of I Am, they believed themselves to be these hyper patriotic people, that what they were praying for and what they were kind of like, summoning as a spiritual body was a defense against the Nazis, a defense against communists and things like that. So it was a new age spirituality with this like big flag waving element to it that I think is really interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of melding of two arenas that, t you typically wouldn't think would mesh with one another, but they
Yeah.
ended up doing it anyway.
Right. Like I think a lot of people think of the new age and they think just like crunchy hippies, like, having crystals and like bonfires or something. And I think it to a point that can be that. But this book is really about where that kind of intersects with these ideas that you would see, within like the Patriot movement and things like that.
Yeah. So moving on to the main character of the book is Amy Carlson. So who is Amy and what sort of led her down the path of becoming Mother God?
Yeah, Amy Carlson was born in Kansas and grew up in Texas in the Dallas area. She was, came from a really, upper middle class suburb, great family, good grades, just kind of this beautiful girl with a lot of promise. And she was somebody who really loved singing. And that is kind of an important element to her story, I think. She had her first child really young, and she became a single mom pretty quickly. Her relationship didn't work out. And she also had a job managing several McDonald's within the Dallas area. So she had a decent job and, was caring for her child, had the support of her family. But, from my reporting, a lot of people told me, Amy really was somebody who thought she was going to be a celebrity. Like she was going to be very famous for her singing and that kind of thing. And life did not go that way for her. She developed a pretty severe drinking issue at a certain point and had two more children in relationships that didn't work out for her. And sometime around, I believe it was 2007, 2008, she was having dinner with her family and literally pushed back from the table at the restaurant and said, "I'm leaving." And they were like, "Oh, okay, you gotta go, no problem." But she meant she just left her life completely. She just was gone like that. And she went and met up with some people that she had met on kind of new age forums on the internet and started living a complete different life. She, before that was just kind of like manicured, very well kept suburban gal, I guess you might say. And she became sort of like a hippie, like grew her hair out and stopped dyeing it and started going from kind of co-op to co-op around the West, living with people, talking about aliens and things like that. So she decided to leave her life and surround herself with people who were talking about things that she thought were really exciting, which were aliens, astrology, conspiracy theories, sort of lightly at first, but then much more later. So after about 10 years of doing this stuff around the West, she settled in southern Colorado in a town called Crestone, which is sort of known as a new age hub in the West. And she started a group. It had several names, but eventually it was called Love Has Won. And she was at the center of the Love Has Won belief system. Her followers called her Mother God. And the big catalyzing idea was that as Mother God, she was not only the center of their ideas, their religious ideas, but she was the earth itself. So any offense against the earth was an offense against her. Any offense against her was an offense against the earth. And so, it was this Amy-centric belief system. And she would start talking about that she was a reincarnated being. She was one of her 500 plus lives that she claimed to have been was Madame Blavatsky, that we just talked about. She talked about being the Queen of Lemuria, and she was encouraging people to move to come live with her, which I think in right now when we talk about like modern kind of cult groups, that's actually kind of unique. A lot of people are you kind of don't need to do that anymore. The predominant following of Love Has Won was online, and she would recruit people through like Facebook groups and online forums and things like that. But she did have a small group of people that lived around her in Colorado.
Hmm. So how big did that group that eventually became Love Is One, eventually, kind of blossomed to.
Well, this was a big thing that I was trying to answer when I was reporting this book, because what it seemed to me was that Love Has Won was mostly just online. And I spoke to, several people who studied new religious movements and kind of this history of the New Age. And what I realized is that like a modern cult group is not, generally like I think a lot of people think of like the Rajneeshis or something. They're
Yeah.
gathering, a bunch of people wearing white gathering together at a compound. And that's not real anymore. I mean, it is to a certain point, but people are mostly cults are mostly online. So that I think is the case with Love Has Won. There were maybe a couple dozen people at any given time that were living around Amy Carlson in Colorado, but she had countless followers online and continues to today. So for this book, I talked a lot to a woman who was a Love Has Won follower in Canada who never met Amy Carlson, hoped to, but was not able to because of COVID, closing down the border. Um, but was donating lots of money. And I thought, well, I guess that actually makes sense. If like a cult group mostly functions to keep its charismatic leader fed and living the lifestyle they want to live, then why have people move to you and you could just be getting Venmo donations from them online, which is a lot of what was happening with Love Has Won.
Yeah. Um, so based on, Amy's story and, the story of some of the side characters that you talk about, Blavatsky, Ballards, a couple others, Elizabeth Clare Prophet and Jay-Z Knight, um, you know, Amy isn't the first to adorn herself with this title of God or a God or this sort of holy being. Um, so she's not the first, and of course she won't be the last. So based on, the research that you did for this book and your interviews with other people, and looking into these other groups that you mentioned throughout the pages, what do you think, eventually pushes these people or these figureheads to make such a bold statement as to say that they are, God or this God reincarnate?
That's a really good question. So I think that there's my mind as you're asking this is going to this really particular Dr. Phil episode that Amy Carlson appeared on. I think
Yeah.
this is another kind of trend within the new age is a lot of the people that I talk about in my book appeared on some kind of daytime talk show at some point to either show their powers or talk about why they were, a god or something like that. So Amy Carlson appeared on Dr. Phil, and there was this kind of exchange between Dr. Phil and Amy Carlson talking about where he's like, "You're literally telling people that you are a god. Don't you see why this is a problem?" And Amy is saying, "But everyone is a god. It's not just me, it's everyone. I'm inspiring everyone." So I think that they were kind of talking past each other, right? Like that's the point of these kinds of shows. But I found that moment to be interesting because I think that is a real catalyzing idea within the new age is that the within new age ideas you can find personal power. And if you interpret it that means that you are a divine being inside, well then great. Like that's kind of the beauty of the new age is that it inspires people to find the personal power that they need through a variety of, activities and belief systems to deal with the problems of the world or whatever, personal struggles they have. So I think with Amy, you could say that's where it came from, was that she was somebody who was a spiritual seeker and found what she needed in the new age and then kind of took it in a, radical direction. I think the other thing though is that a lot of the people I wrote about in my book are people who were experiencing some kind of struggle at that point. Amy is a great example. Here's this person who thought I was going to be famous. Life didn't go the way I wanted it to. And she was able to kind of find a way where, okay, maybe I won't be a famous singer, but I'll be a god instead. And I think that is it sounds basic and ridiculous when I say it like that, but I was sort of surprised time and time again how these specifically female figures in my book were having a problem and decided, you know what? I'm not going to be Amy Carlson anymore. I'm going to be Mother God now. There are other people I talk about, like Edna Ballard. I'm not going to be Edna Ballard anymore. I'm going to be Lotus Ray King. And there's like a personal rebrand where people leave the old self behind and become this new godlike persona. I'm not sure that that answers your question specifically, but I do think that that's kind of the trend that I notice with each of these figures.
No, I think that does, because you kind of hit at it where you said, there may be some sort of personal shortcoming or some circumstance in this person's life where they feel the need to completely reinvent themselves, and they might not be able to invent themselves through material means like getting a better job or moving somewhere. So they take the next best thing, which is the spiritual reinvention of themselves, and they put themselves at the center of it.
Yeah. Yeah, which is interesting because it's not illegal. They're
No,
not doing anything that isn't, I mean, there are other things I think that we could talk about that border on illegality, but that is something I found to be really, really interesting. Like during COVID, we saw all these people kind of saying like, I'm a spiritual guru on Instagram, come to my retreat, let's go to Mount Shasta together. Um, that is a thing that has been protected in America, that you can claim that you're a spiritual or religious person. And, you know, you should read the book if you're interested, but, there's a Supreme Court decision around the I am activity and them selling basically snake oil cures to people and whether or not that's illegal. And it's something that bounced in and out of the court system for years, eventually ended up in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, hey, we cannot say what people can believe. Like, we also aren't here to legislate whether or not their beliefs are true. It's a really stunning moment in American history when we talk about the protections around religion. And the dissents in that are very, very interesting to see that these justices saw, boy, we're about to open a can of worms here and let anybody say, oh yeah, this is my religious belief. But it's the beginning of a long history where people can just kind of create their own thing, call it a religion, and get away with a lot.
yeah. So I kind of wanted to pull on the thread that you mentioned of like legality or illegality, and how that sort of intersects with the health and wellness space, because it ultimately intersects with it all the time. Um, a lot of these movements and, Amy and her group as well sold, quote unquote health products, dietary supplements, colloidal silver, run the gamut, you name it. They've
Hmm.
all done it. Um, and that was, a big sort of financial grift for them. Um, so how do these groups and these movements sort of monetize themselves, even if it's not just health, like how do they sustain themselves financially?
So with Love Has Won, they had a kind of a menu of things that they would offer. So the biggest one was this like spiritual healings that they could do for people. So as a group, of the people who lived in Colorado around Amy, they would kind of wake up in the morning, they lived in community, and they would kind of get to work on what they said was like spreading love, into the universe. And their way of doing that was the Love Has Won chat rooms, was social media, was talking to people in Facebook comments and things like that. So they started holding live streams, which they would hold for up to 6 hours a day. That was like, a couple of shows or three 2 hour shows. And they would get donations during those shows where they would, solicit people to send things on PayPal or Venmo. They would sell all kinds of products, art, things like that. But these spiritual healings were for people who were really serious about, what they were talking about. They would say, we can get Mother God on the phone with you and she can heal you of your ailments. It sounds ridiculous, but this is a thing that's been going on in the new age for a really long time. This idea that you don't have to be physically present with someone, but they can heal you. So, that people would get on the phone. They often would not end up being on the phone with Amy, but they would end up on the phone with one of her, followers who would talk all about their belief system and why Mother God was God and God was a woman and that sort of thing. So those cost money, and you get one person on the phone once, you start to sell them more of those healings and things like that. And then, of course, there's, like you say, these kind of remedies that were big. So Love Has Won had a whole menu of items that they would sell, but specifically colloidal silver was their big one. They would make this themselves, and claim that it could cure just about anything, including COVID. And they were issued many letters from the FDA telling them, you can't make these kind of health claims and stuff. But again, this is like not an original idea. These healing surgeries over the phone, selling colloidal silver, that is stuff that has been going on through the decades. And it is sort of surprising to me as a reporter, like how toothless the enforcement of these things are. Like basically what Love Has Won would do is they'd get a letter from the FDA and then they would just start producing colloidal silver under a different business name or a different, nonprofit and things like that. Or they'd say they were a religious organization. And so, yeah, there was just kind of not a lot of enforcement. And the unfortunate thing about Love Has Won is they were kind of coming to prominence during COVID when a lot of people were really freaked out about what was going on. They were sowing so much different disinformation about the coronavirus and the cures for it or whatever. Um, so they were able to sell that kind of thing to a lot of people and kind of like, sink their claws into people who are really scared already and willing to say like, okay, hey, I'll buy a $300 bottle of colloidal silver and maybe that'll help me.
$300?
Sorry, $333.
Yeah. The
It's always
significance of the numbers.
111,
Yeah.
222. Yeah. So there were, they had high ticket items too.
Yeah. Um, so, as we kind of move towards the end of the story, what eventually happened to Amy and Love Has Won? Throughout the course of the book, you talk about how they gradually become more and more, not necessarily extreme, but very grounded in their own belief system, and they grow, gradually more what we would kind of say delusional. So what ultimately happened to the group?
So as 2020, COVID unfolds and things like that, the live streams became more aggressive. I would definitely say they did grow more extreme because as a part of Amy's, mythology that she would tell about herself, she would say, when I was the Queen of Lemuria, Donald Trump was my father there. He was the king of Lemuria. So he is here to save us. We can trust him. They became very, very into Trump and his politics. They became really into QAnon. They would have Q updates on their live stream and talk about all these kind of conspiracy theories around that. And but as this was happening, Amy Carlson was getting more and more and more frail. So you started where Amy was at the center of the live streams for quite a long time, even by herself for a while. She slowly faded out of the group and you didn't see her anymore, but the group, had big portraits of her in the background as they were talking. She became sicker and sicker. She would claim by 2020 that she had stage 5 cancer, which is not there is no stage 5 cancer, but she lost her ability to walk. She had to be carried everywhere. She just became like a skeleton. And in April of 2021, she passed away. Her a medical examiner found that she had died from a combination of anorexia, alcohol abuse, and colloidal silver poisoning. And why a lot of people know about this group is the sensationalism around her death. So Amy was found dead. She had been dead for some time and living in her body was in the Love Has Won house and people were living around her body and created a shrine out of her body. Her skin had also turned blue, which is something that has happened before to other people that have really ingested a lot of colloidal silver. It poisons you. It's silver. So at the time there was a lot, it was tabloid fodder. I mean, look, here's this crazy lady who lives in Colorado, is mummified, and all of her followers were worshiping her blue body. It is ridiculous. But I think that that's where I wanted to be like, that's crazy. This is a human. How did this human get to be this way? So obviously the book is a long study in trying to answer that. after she died, her followers, they had long been talking about ascension in the same ways that groups like Heaven's Gate talked about it, that we're gonna, we're going to ascend out of this dimension and into space or into the 5D, fifth dimension, as people will talk about. So I think her followers were a little surprised when she died that they had her body still. They thought maybe it would go to the 5D. They never really kind of had a plan for what that was going to look like. So several of them faced charges for abuse of a corpse that were all dropped eventually. And you can still find online quite a lot of people that have photos of Amy Carlson as their profile pictures on Facebook and things like that. And I would say the group is not organized anymore, but belief in Amy Carlson as Mother God still certainly exists. A lot of her followers then broke away and started their own groups. I'm not sure the current status of a lot of those, but in the pretty immediate aftermath, her two most prominent live streamers broke away, started a new group, began manufacturing colloidal silver under a different name, and the story just continues that way.
Yeah. So, Amy dies, these people start their own groups or these breakoffs. So they haven't quite left the movement or this frame of mind. But some people did.
Mhm.
You talk about a couple of those people and you talk about moving away and deprogramming, I guess. Um, so what were some of the difficulties that these people faced in, you know, deprogramming themselves, especially those who kind of fall into the more obscene and the more extreme and the more dangerous parts of New Age beliefs?
So I think the thing that was surprising to me was how, I can understand if you're living in like a remote compound with other people that it can be hard to leave or whatever. I found that same mentality really applied with the people who were online members of Love Has Won. So, um, specifically, I think Kim, who's in my book, she talks a
Hmm.
lot about this. She was living in Canada and was really structuring her entire life around the rhythms of Love Has Won, regardless of her being physically with them. So, she'd watch the live streams all day, she'd be in the comments, she was talking to other people, trying to recruit members, things like that. When that all went away for her, it was before Amy died, but not too long before she died. You know, um, there had been a pretty aggressive effort by her family to say, like, you gotta come back to us. Like they could feel her slipping away. When you take somebody out of that, regardless if they're in person or online, she was being taken out of her community. All of a sudden, she found a lot of people that she felt understood her in a way that no one else had. So I thought that was really powerful. I think that speaks to the ways that we can find community online. And when you remove that, how truly, truly difficult that is. So for Kim, she confided in me, and it's in the book, the ways that, she was trying to escape a lot of problems by engaging with Love Has Won. They were giving her the answers that she wanted to hear to the problems that she was dealing with. And when she left that group, all those problems were still there for her to find. So I think that is one of the biggest hurdles for people is you are choosing to lose your community and you now have to deal with the things that maybe brought you there in the first place. So I think that's all a part of that deprogramming. There were other people that I spoke to, family members and things like that, who kind of lost people to the group, even very briefly, who
Hmm.
were just so excited by the ideas and believed them so much that it just took a while for them to come to a slow reality of like that this is not real. Amy Carlson is not God. She wasn't God, or, that kind of thing. But I think that this is the nature of like why belief is so hard. Like, how can you tell somebody this is not God? Like, right? There's not a lot of fact-based things you could say here. This is the nature of belief. And I think that this is what made this book kind of like a kind of funky reporting project, is you're trying to apply fact to a thing that isn't necessarily tied up in facts.
Hmm.
So, I think that they're just what I learned about deprogramming people from these online groups is that it just is a very slow process and takes a great deal of patience and love from the people around those people to say, like, you got to go slow, but like Amy was not God. And here's how we can continue talking about that. So it's difficult.
Yeah, seems like one of the more difficult aspects of, even reporting for this book or even,
Yeah.
just speaking to people is you
Yeah.
have to confront that with them almost. And, they might not have come to that conclusion before they even spoke to you. So now you're the first person to sort of be on the front line of them leaving it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I've often found that like my conversations with folks all through, different new age groups, past and present were really interesting because, we'd be talking and then some of these more conspiratorial ideas would come up and I'd say, "Do you really believe that?" And they'd be like, "Well, yeah, absolutely." So I could see, yeah, okay, you might not believe that this person is a god or a guru, but you still do believe in a lot of these ideas within this ecosystem. And I think that that's, where I'm kind of a weird reporter. I think a lot of reporters might just judge that. And for me, I was like, okay, there's so much here that is not harmful. Like if you want to believe that clouds are UFOs, I don't really see the harm in that. Like, so like I had a lot of sources for this book that were people that were just like, yeah, I still believe that, 9/11 was an inside job and that clouds are UFOs, but I can see that Amy Carlson was a toxic person. So yeah, there were times that the reporting for this drove me a little crazy because I was like, where is the reality here? How do you kind of find a clear through line?
Yeah, I'd imagine so.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So with that, I think we'll conclude the formal portion of my questions, and we'll start to take some questions from the audience. Um, so the first one that we have, in the age of social media, how do cult leaders adapt their recruitment strategies to exploit algorithm-driven isolation?
Hmm. Um, I think that there, in some ways, it's no different than how people would have, I like the tech component of this, I think is a thing I probably can't specifically speak to, but what I do know is that if you look at all the different people in this book through history, the common thread is that they're exploiting fear. Like that I think was what was so egregious about COVID is you just had people who were deeply afraid about what was going to happen and they were stuck at home. So, so you just had a lot of people offering answers. And I say that very generally, new age and beyond. Here's the thing you need. Here's the class you need to take. Here's this or that or the next thing. So, yeah, it's not a great answer, but I do think that like fear to me became the most exploitable thing that I could find from generation to generation is like uh, are you afraid about a virus? Are you afraid about the government? Are you afraid about politics or polluted water or whatever? And those are great, great ways. But this is the case, I think, with any, that's why this has ended up being a story of extremism for me to write about, is like that is very common in extremism on a local or national level. If you have a problem in your community and all of a sudden a militia comes in and offers to help you with that, you might start then being willing to hear their ideas. So I think that that was the case, and that with new age leaders during COVID, and social media just makes that very, very convenient to get in touch with those people.
Yeah. So you didn't want to write about extremism, but it sort of, turned out that way in a roundabout sort of way. So is there a point where unconventional spirituality morphs into extremism?
I
And
think so. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think because you take away the crystals and the like, loose clothing and the yoga pants and the like talk of love and light, and Love Has Won was talking about how much they love Trump. They were talking about QAnon. They were really anti-Semitic.
Mhm.
Um, you know, if I had not been looking at them on a screen and had only been hearing them, like this is a radio show, I would have thought this is like a patriot movement radio show. So yeah, I think so. I don't know that there's something specific, the new age is something that is so broad and diffuse. Like you could put crystals under that and yoga and like healthy eating and like there's no one idea. But I do think that there is something about it that seems to be attractive to people who are trying to reject the mainstream and say we're questioning of spiritual systems, but within the new age you find a lot of people who are questioning the government, questioning the health and pharmaceutical industry, and it creates kind of just well, people often call it pastel QAnon, and I think
Yeah.
that makes sense why.
Yeah. Could be a poor choice of words, but it's kind of like the gateway drug,
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Like, I mean, we've all heard, I think probably people who are familiar with extremism studies, like this idea of the funnel, right? Like you got the top end and you've got your, little like, okay, you might entertain something about there's a grand Jewish conspiracy, and then all of a sudden you're sliding down the funnel into more and more radical ideas. And I certainly think, on the quote unquote left there is that too, especially around health related things.
Yeah. Um, so another question that we have is there a pattern in the types of people who become cult leaders versus those who follow them? And are there warning signs in their early lives or their behavior?
What a great question. I'm trying to think. So in this book, I talked about quite a few characters we haven't mentioned, specifically Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who ran a group called the Church Universal and Triumphant, a woman named J.Z. Knight, who runs Ramtha School of Enlightenment currently, and Blavatsky, the Ballards. These were all people who had a deep spirituality as young people who felt pushed away, I think, by that spirituality at one point. What I talk about a lot in the book is that these are all female characters um, who felt a sense of rejection from their church, or who maybe wanted more power. And I think that that's something that I've noticed, even with my first book with about Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. Those were people who the mainstream churches that they were a part of and their ideas, it's like it wasn't enough. They felt themselves much more spiritually enlightened and like kind of bored by what was happening in church. So they decided to kind of like take it further, to study harder, to say, actually, I think I understand the true meaning of this faith. So, in Lori and Chad's part, they did what many people who have started breakaway Mormon sects have done. I understand that the mainstream church doesn't know what they're talking about. Listen to me. And I think in this new age, there were people who grew up in the Christian church, who grew up in Christian Scientists, who again, they just wanted to like level up in a bit. So I think if there's any kind of warning sign, I think it could be that. Where you find that line between somebody who is deeply spiritual and someone who's maybe taking it too far, I'm not sure I'm the person to know what that line is, but I think that is kind of one thing I would say.
Yeah. Another question is what ethical dilemmas do journalists face when covering cults? How do you avoid unintentionally amplifying their message? This is a question that kind of came up for me too, like during the course of the discussion. So I'd love to hear, what some of the difficulties you faced in writing the book were, and obviously the amplification that Amy got on Dr. Phil.
Yes, 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 yes. Okay, great question. I love this. This is sort of a two-part question. So the ethical dilemma, I think, in covering cults is that it is very sensitive. This is a topic that is often sensationalized. So, for me, I am generally attracted to a spectacle. As a reporter, I want to write about it, not get in and muck around with the, tabloid journalists, but really try and capture it from a like a 50,000 foot view. Like I did that with my first book. Here is this thing that occurred with these two people. Here's how it was covered. Here's how they became this sort of like hated people. So I think that to me, I'm more interested in ideology than anything else. So if a story doesn't have like a deep wormhole to fall into of like where these ideas came from, what the historical and social context was, maybe how a scientific theory that was a decent theory got manipulated, that then I'm not really interested. So it has to have a lot of that kind of like deep context, I think, for me to personally feel okay covering it. I think also that word cult is something that if people are throwing out that word, I would be skeptical about their journalism because I think that there's a lot of scholarship around spirituality. The use of the word cult in a way just otherizes anything that isn't seen as a mainstream religion. So,
Hmm.
so I think that's another thing, like that reporters should be very aware how loaded that word cult is, the images that it kind of evokes in the reader's head.
Yeah.
As far as
Sorry to interrupt. I don't
Yeah,
think you called Love is One a cult at all in the book. I don't think you
intentionally.
explicitly came out and said that.
Yeah, I believe I at one point I was in editing and I realized the word cult doesn't appear in the book until over 200 pages in, and that was by design.
Yeah.
Just because, I think that the new age is a whole thing that I can understand why people who may not feel included within their more mainstream spirituality may indulge in new age ideas. And I wanted to make sure that this book isn't like just like poo-hooing that.
Yeah.
So as far as amplifying their ideas, I mean, I would apply the exact same lens that I would to writing about somebody on the far right. That, the simple existence of someone having anti-Semitic ideas, maybe, might not be worth writing about. You have to kind of go through a criteria and say, okay, why are we writing about this specific person? Are they spreading this message in a way that is really effective? Are they recruiting people? Is this their platform? Are they someone in a position of power? So, but I also think, like with Blavatsky, I think that's a great example. I could have written just about all of her root race theories and just left it at that. But I think it was really important to bring in scholarly voices around the discussion of her idea that the Aryan race is the most, supreme, to say this was racist then and it's racist now. And Nazis are really excited about it. So, like, I think that is one thing is I think where journalism goes wrong is just like putting it out there and letting it sit there. Like, I think you have to. I've seen this a lot in reporting in the West. Not to get distracted, but like I think a great example is this secessionist movement in Oregon, where I live, called the Greater Idaho Movement. And we've seen so many reporters come into the region and say, "Wow, these people are really going to break away half the state of Oregon and start their own state." I ended up doing a story, sort of feeling pushed like I had to, because all of those reporters were missing the long racist history of secessionism in Oregon and how this is just the latest chapter. So I think as responsible journalists, you have to do research. I know that's like maybe not what everybody's excited about, but to me, that is a big part of the job is you are informed to accurately inform your audience. You have to be saying, here's the idea, but also here's the context that idea lives in. So
Yeah. Um, so, for me and other, researchers in this academic sort of space, do you think we can still learn from that? When we're researching these sorts of people or these groups, um, do you think that we could take lessons from journalism in that respect too?
I think that it would only help your research if you understood that, like this lady in Colorado was not the first person to say that she was the Queen of Lemuria. If this
Yeah.
was your specific, I would hope that where, yeah, I think so. I think that only makes the research stronger for the next generation of people who comes along and reads your paper or whatever, your book, it says, "Oh, okay, now that makes more sense to me." It's yeah, I think that that's just responsible.
Yeah, agreed. All right. So with that, in the interest of time, I think that we'll conclude our Q&A portion from our audience members. So Leah, before we go, where can our audience members find your work?
Yeah, so you can always come to my website, which is just my first and last name, leahsottile.com. I'm pretty good about updating it. I think for more active updates, I do have a Substack newsletter. It's again leahsottile.substack.com, and I also have a newsletter subscription link on my website. But it's a a project that I write essay. My earring just fell out. I write I write essays about journalism there. I talk a lot about reporting on extremism and kind of ways to do that in kind of like we're talking about right now. So on Substack, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on Instagram, I'm on the internet. So yeah, I can be found pretty easily.
Yeah. All right, everybody. So you heard the woman. Go follow her on social media, buy her book, to listen to her podcast, do all the good stuff, and help support her work. So Leah, on behalf of the program and our audience, we thank you for joining us today and talking about your new book. Hope to see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.